Hi, my name is Caitlyn, and I want to talk today about the role of sleep in endocrine health and performance for female athletes. I want to start with the question. How many of you athletes know that sleep is important for your athletic performance? I'm guessing most people do. But why and how exactly does it impact the body? For female athletes especially, maintaining health is directly linked to optimal performance and long-term health, and sleep is a vital and often overlooked part of a person's lifestyle that can affect injury risk, athletic performance, and general health. Discussions regarding sleep and athletic performance for female athletes are becoming more common, but there's still very little research on the topic. Obviously, poor sleep is correlated with physical changes in both men and women, but these changes often present themselves differently in women, especially in terms of hormones like luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and estradiol. These hormones constantly fluctuate due to the menstrual cycle, and they can both be affected by and affect sleep, and that in turn affects performance. In order to synthesize findings on how sleep disturbances can impact performance and injury risk through endocrine pathways, two separate searches were conducted following PRISMA guidelines. One on how sleep disturbances impact the endocrine system, and two on how hormones like luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and estradiol impact performance and injury risk. To search for how sleep disturbances impact hormonal levels, keywords like sleep, endocrine, and female, along with variations like woman, estrogen, and estradiol were used. And studies were included if they discussed poor sleep and its effects on the endocrine system, and the population was premenopausal women. Studies were excluded if they didn't meet any of these criteria. 100 studies were screened for the title, and in the end, 4 studies were included in the final review, plus one additional one identified through a systematic review found in the literature search. To search for how hormonal levels impact performance and injury risk, on the other hand, keywords like athlete, performance, and estrogen were used, along with variations like hypoestrogenemia and low estrogen. They were included if they discussed the female athlete triad or relative energy deficiency syndrome and its effects on performance, because those conditions can impact hormones and therefore impact performance. They also were included if the study discussed female endocrine alterations on performance, the effect of female endocrine alterations on performance, or related incidents of injury to hormonal changes. Studies were excluded if they didn't meet any of these criteria. 428 total studies were screened for the title, and 14 studies were included in the final review. Before I jump into talking about how sleep can impact hormones, I want to differentiate between two different types of sleep deprivation. One is short-term sleep deprivation, which was studied by 3/5 of the studies in this review. That refers to sleep deprivation over periods of 3 days to 1 month. On the other hand, long-term sleep deprivation, which was studied by two of the studies included in this review, refers to sleep deprivation that accumulates by a few hours lost every night for many years. In athletes, though, long-term sleep deprivation is much more likely to occur, and there isn't much research on this, so further longitudinal research is needed to determine how long-term sleep deprivation can affect the endocrine system. Now, all 5 studies analyzed showed a connection between hormonal or bone health and sleep schedules. Hormones were shown to be controlled by a 24-hour circadian rhythm by one study, and the circadian rhythm is controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. Studies found that estradiol, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, progesterone, prolactin, and a protein called sex hormone-binding globulin followed a 24-hour circadian rhythm, showing that it can be affected by sleep. In one study also, a higher prevalence of osteopenia was observed in middle-aged women for poor sleep quality. Since bone health is regulated by estrogen, osteopenia, or lower bone density, can be evidence for lower estrogen levels. Overall, across all these studies, sleep quality was shown to have an effect on the endocrine system, even though the direction and magnitude of these changes varied, and the type of sleep deprivation was also different in some of the studies. In addition, while sleep disturbances can cause hormonal changes, some of these might be hard to observe in real life with daily stresses and athletic drive, so further research is needed to see if these hormonal changes will actually present in performance deficits. In terms of performance, I want to start with strength, VO2 max, and power. In the studies analyzed, one found that neither the use of hormonal contraceptive or menstrual phase, which can both impact the endocrine system, it significantly impacted performance factors including squat jump height, isometric mid-thigh and a 20-meter sprint. And these are all tests that measure both strength and explosive power. Other studies also found similar results, but in terms of VO2 or oxygen consumption, studies found that it didn't vary significantly with submaximal exercise, but for submaximal exercise, rate of perceived exertion between early follicular phase and late follicular phase to early luteal phase varied significantly. This indicates that even though there's no actual difference in numbers, there's a noticeable difference in how the athlete feels while doing the exercise. In addition, in terms of VO2 max, which is the oxygen consumption in an all-out effort, this did vary significantly between menstrual phases, indicating that hormonal changes may affect aerobic fitness much more than raw strength or power. In terms of agility, balance, and posture, one study, Cannissier et al., found that significant differences in agility. There were significant differences in agility between mid-cycle and early follicular phase, but Ogle et al. Found no differences in agility. Cannissier found differences with a small sample size of 10 but much more sensitive tests, while Ogle et al. Found no significant differences but with a larger sample size but much less sensitive testing. Two studies also concluded that balance varies significantly across the cycle, although that same study found no differences. The same study that found no differences in agility also found no differences in balance. In addition, one study found differences in postural sway that increased significantly after fatigue in the premenstrual phase but not follicular phase or early luteal phase. Overall, the results for agility, balance, and posture varied, likely due to the use of different phase tracking techniques or the aforementioned differences in test sensitivity. In addition, while most studies didn't account for post-fatigue performance, this was shown to affect postural sway, which indicates that it could affect balance and agility as well. In terms of bone stress injury risk, one study found that having 3 or more bone stress injuries or low bone density was associated with amenorrhea, or the loss of a period that's usually caused by low estradiol levels. Similarly, another study that compared athletes with a normal period or eumenorrheic athletes to oligomenorrheic athletes or athletes with an irregular period showed that oligomenorrhea was correlated with low bone mineral density and bone mineral content. Together, these results indicate that lowered estradiol levels can increase the risk for bone stress injuries by lowering bone mineral content and bone mineral density. In terms of other injuries, one study found that there was an increase in anterior knee joint laxity during ovulation, where estrogen levels are higher. In other words, stability is compromised by changes in estradiol, progesterone, and other hormones that impact the cycle. In addition, the study also found that quad muscle recruitment increased but hamstring muscle recruitment decreased during ovulation, which creates a muscle imbalance that stresses the ACL. For this study, it was limited by a small number of studies discussing the effects of sleep on the endocrine system and how that plays into performance and injury risk. To compensate for this, 2 separate searches were conducted, one to find the effects of sleep on the endocrine system, and 2 to find the effect of these changes on performance. Many studies that were included in the review also had varied methods of collecting data and small sample sizes. The methods varied in collecting menstrual phase data, sleep quality data, and performance metrics. In addition, most studies that discussed hormonal fluctuations and how they affected performance used the menstrual cycle as a natural cyclical fluctuation of these hormones, but sleep deprivation would likely either amplify these changes or cause a change in an entirely different direction, so the effects could also be different too. Despite these limitations, however, these findings emphasize the role of the female athlete's reproductive hormones in her performance and the key role of sleep in regulating these hormones. Poor sleep disrupts endocrine axes, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis that produces estrogens and other female sex hormones. Studies also demonstrated how changes in these hormonal levels results in performance consequences like increased injury risk, reduced aerobic capacity, and compromised agility and balance. It's important to note, though, that there is a discrepancy between these hormonal changes resulting from sleep loss causing identifiable changes in the lab versus true observable impacts in real life, and this is a critical gap in female athlete research. Therefore, in the future, further research is needed to examine the specific effects of sleep on the endocrine system and its role in performance using larger sample sizes and consistent menstrual tracking to further quantify the effects. Despite these limitations, however, clear patterns still emerge, and it's clear that sleep should not solely just be viewed as a recovery mechanism, but also an important contributor to endocrine health and performance for female athletes. Thank you.